Hello, my name is Boogs, and this is an analysis of the Stanley Parable. If you do not know anything about the game or what it's about, I seriously cannot tell you enough times to consider purchasing it on PC or wait for the upcoming console release of its Ultra Deluxe version, in order to at least experience some or all of the game for yourself. This video will probably be very long. The description and pinned comment will include title timestamps if you prefer watching the video bit by bit, which is understandable. From this point on, things I'm about to say and show on screen will spoil the game's main appeal and premise, and quickly spoil as well major points of interest. Consider these words as your final warning.
And the two doors was just like the first thing that came to mind, and it stuck in my mind because I couldn't make sense out of it. Because, you know, the narrator says Stanley walked through the left door, so it's in the past tense, but you still have the ability to go through the right door, and if you could do it multiple times, how would that reconcile? Would they be considered a part of the same game? Would they be separate games? These were questions that I like. In just trying to even hold and contain that scenario, it was impossible. And so the conclusion that I came to then was that, okay, this is going to be an impossible game. This is going to have to be an inherently contradictory game.
This video is, as the title says, an attempt at making a narrative analysis of the entirety of the Stanley Parable. I feel like this may mislead some people, so here's what this video is not. This isn't a theory about the reality the game takes place in or how certain things in the game are possible. This isn't a compilation of every video game trope the game uses and or subverts. This isn't a review of the game because, like I said, watching this video is preferable if you've already played it and possibly got a refresher of how the game flows recently. What this video is, however, is an attempt to make a cohesive, singular takeaway from the game, not necessarily in order to find its deep message about the medium or anything. It began with my question I felt after playing it again and asking myself, what am I supposed to think after leaving this game? I want to find a singular purpose for the Stanley Parable's narrative, and even though the clip I showed earlier showed the game's main developer and writer, Davey Wreden, claiming what I'm doing here is impossible, I'm doing it anyway. This is my first time taking on a project and a video of this length, and I hope you'll enjoy it, and thank you. Let's begin. The video structure will first work as overviews of each of the game's various endings, along with general thoughts and observations, and as I go on, I will begin to connect more bits and pieces together with points I made earlier. So if I seem like I'm making really long stretches in logic, there's a pretty high chance that I'm relying on points I already made earlier in the video. After covering each ending, and trust me, I'll list everything you may think I might have glossed over by the point I get to all the endings. Then I'll diverge from ending-specific discussion and begin working entirely off of my previous ideas and concepts up until the end. I call something an ending as much as the Stanley Parable wiki does, save for endings that can flow from them into another ending, invalidating the former's place as ending. The only two endings on the Stanley Parable wiki affected by this, and thus not considered by me as an ending, are the whiteboard ending and the broom closet ending. If you know what these are, I'm sure you can agree with me that those aren't endings, just moments in-game that are actually called ending, and in both cases are a passing joke and don't provide any closure. I will go against certain rules here and there, and I will soon explain what I consider, for example, a beginning is, and then immediately go against that definition. Please continue watching as I will try my best to explain any mismatch between my own words as early and clearly as possible. Additionally, I want to clarify in advance that I will refer to the player character with they, them pronouns, Stanley and the narrator with he, him pronouns, and the narrator from the museum ending with she, her pronouns, as I don't think there are any issues with doing so. Now, many would assume the first ending I should cover is the game's main ending, the ending the narrator will lead the player to if they follow in his guidance, the freedom ending. Instead, I will cover the ending I think a vast majority of players will encounter as their first, the gaming ending. It's officially called the game's ending on the Stanley Parable wiki, but in order to avoid confusion between saying the game's ending and the game's ending, I would just call it the gaming ending. When Stanley first came to a set of two open doors, many players will do something this kind of presentation just begs of them to do: test the limits of this game as soon as they can. The controls of the Stanley Parable are limited to rotating the camera in a complete first-person sphere, walking in as many directions as their input method allows them, crouching, and interacting with objects, which mostly involves pushing buttons and opening doors. The player is sometimes met with a small interaction when using this action button on many office items in the opening area of the game, but isn't really anyone's focus once the game starts to be more interesting, and fittingly, less things react to interacting with them the longer you play for on each time, save for areas themed around interacting with objects. You can't jump either. The game mocks your attempt of it with an achievement granted for pressing space a good handful of times, likely showing up once a player attempts to jump, cannot, and to make sure, mashes the button a few more times and is faced with this achievement. Like every other game, I'm sure players begin their control over the game system with testing what they can do in the first area. Due to the fact that there's nearly nothing to do and barely any control over anything in this office, players are itching to make any impact on their surrounding, which leads to the most disobedient path possible, being many players' first ending and memory of this game. The narrator assumes Stanley's first wrong turn to the right on the two doors as Stanley's own decision, and says that Stanley prefers to inspect another part of the office first, just to admire it, before following the story proper. After not doing that, Stanley reaches a warehouse and faces a moving platform. He gets on, and as he is being scolded by the narrator for his selfish and careless behavior, Stanley jumps down to a catwalk beneath him. And now the player is aware that disobedience can be in forms other than doors and buttons, but also their movement options. This concept is explored a bit further if the player then follows the narrator only once, leading them to the Zending, where the player is yet again presented with the opportunity to jump down a platform as a choice. I will not cover the Zending in its entirety, but I explain why later, as I still cover a major portion of it. After they jump down the catwalk, the player is presented with a promise from the narrator to prove them that the narrator only means well, and tells them that's true if you follow him into the red door on the left, where the aforementioned Zending is. Entering the blue door against the narrator's will establish the narrator's identity and role in the gaming ending, where he is a game developer and or designer. This is no longer a case of a storyteller facing obstacles, but a game developer going actively out of their way to set a player back in their tracks by teleporting Stanley back to the red and blue doors. The process repeats twice with slightly more involvement every time, where each time the player can still follow the instructions and enter the ending. However, entering the blue door for the third time fully marks the beginning of this ending. I don't think I need to define what I consider an ending as a whole, aside from the exceptions I mentioned earlier, but I do think I should establish that any ending in the Stanley Parable has a beginning. I define this point as the final choice you make that alters the plot and culmination for the current run, and not the point where the establishment of the player or the narrator's role is, but simply the final decision that affects the endpoint, and that its alternatives would have resulted in a separate closure. So, even though I'm well aware the narrative of the gaming ending pretty much starts when you drop from the moving platform, the beginning of it is only when you pass the blue door for the third time, locking in the closure. On the other hand, some endings have choices within them that don't alter the culmination of the game. For example, in the gaming ending, after some chatter about the path you chose actually being an unfinished game map, solidifying the narrator as a game designer for sure, he then wishes to improve your experience with his game, and you are presented with 3 doors instead of 2. All 3 doors are actually leading to a single room with 2 entrances by an impossible tunnel, which is something I will consider at face value for the game. I will not question this. I consider the world of Stanley Parable as one where impossibility isn't something to consider a big deal, it's simply different. Anyway, my point here is that this choice doesn't matter, and the dialogue for these 3 doors is not different whatsoever. A player is likely to understand that this was a real choice, but a small beta test, when they are then asked to rate their experience from a scale of 1 to 5. After they choose the number they are rating with, the narrator responds, not really on the experiment or related to the 3 doors themselves, but rather on the meaning of the number as a review score. For example, if you choose to rate him with 3 stars, he comments on your lack of ability to form a real opinion. If you rate him 1, he is insulted and wants more feedback, even though you clearly can only answer with this number on a button. This whole sequence is somewhat of a stab at the idea that a single person's review score is indefinite and the scoring systems are more fit for mass balling and not single critical thoughts. That said, all 5 buttons here do indeed have differing dialogue according to the ranking, and that is obvious to the player once they hear any of the 5 for the first time through. The player is likely to take a note of this in their head and maybe think to replay this ending to get a different response and perhaps an entirely new ending as a result. This is false. There is no value bigger than the surface level response for choosing another number, and the ending would play out exactly the same way. After this first 5 button feedback, Stanley is taken to see yet another new idea, the leaderboards, which is, I like it, it's a short and simple visual gag, and after that, the player needs to rank this change from 1 to 5 again. This is one of the worst moments of the game as this has missing dialogue.
Hey, I nearly forgot I got a prototype of a new game I've been working on.
Every option of these 5 buttons, the same buttons that just had differing results last time, will not only the same result, it's a result separate from your input. It's an incredibly awkward cut to the next part. This may just feel slightly abrupt on your first playthrough, but upon replaying you will notice this missing reaction way more properly. This ending gets even more awkward to replay after this scene. The narrator implied game designer takes you to his new game idea, a more artistic and holistic one, where you must protect a baby from a fire for 4 hours to achieve pure artistic ascendance. You don't do this. The amount of time you have to dedicate to this unexpected thing was absolutely not meant to be a part of a traditional playing experience many hours into the game. I never did this. Few have, and thousands, maybe millions, have watched it online in summary. It's clearly on the level of an Easter egg for spending too much time with a minigame. In fact, this ending goes beautifully against everything the game wants you to do, in and outside of the spoken dialogue's context. It's claiming that pushing a button after being told to do so for 4 hours is the definition of art. It's a simple joke on the idea of, Stanley pushing a button for 4 hours after disobeying that very command and more in order to even get here. It's not a short joke, but it's a simple one. I think this is meant to be quickly dismissed by the player on a normal playing experience that isn't particularly knowing it's an art ending run in advance. All you're realistically expected to do your first time through is eventually, and probably rather quickly, let the baby's cardboard cutout burn to a crisp. From then, the narrator completely gives up and loads a series of maps from other popular games. I don't understand why this ending continues for as long as it does. The novelty is nice, but by the end of the Portal 2 map, there's little reason to keep the player in. After some novel nods to the games shown, the narrator will leave Stanley, who is then left to drop down a pit and explore a work-in-progress map, from which he can descend even lower into the original Stanley Parable map, from when it was a simple mod for Half-Life 2, which too is slightly decaying. I don't know why these 2 parts are in the game. They would have fit more, if at all, during the museum with a bit of flavor text and only one segment of it for comparison. As it is, this segment isn't only unclear to those who didn't know about the mod, and even if they did, the lighting in this segment is extremely poor. I'm sure it's intentionally, but it's so dark that any meaningful design choices of this area will go absolutely unnoticed and don't serve any purpose aside from stretching this already fairly long and dragging ending. Well, anyway, once the player enters Stanley's old office from within that map, nothing happens until they step back out of it, and the screen cuts to black where the narrator monologues as the closure of this ending.
He needs me. Someone who will wrap everything up at the end, to make sense out of the chaos and the fear and the confusion. That's who I am. That is what I mean to this world. Oh, yes. Yes, I'll be back. There's no other way. Once this ends, after it all comes to a close, then I'll be back. The end will be here soon. Very soon. I can wait.
After this, the game resets on its own. That's it for the overview of this ending, and before I continue, I do want to talk a little more about what I pointed out earlier of how the second raiding sequence has lines seemingly missing from it before going to the baby game. This is the only time the Stanley Parable HD Remix, as its current version on Steam, has strictly missing content in the middle of an ending. And it's so glaring because it is missing content after disappointing content after the first ending many people experience. I'll repeat, This is most people's first time interacting with this game, and it's the ending that leaves the worst taste, specifically after a replay. It's long, requires many repetitive tasks, and the choices within it don't matter, and if you want to test things within it, you need to spend a lot of time, and even with saving and loading, it's nearly non-existent value. Although I personally don't do this, imagine the following me. It sounds to me like a reasonable and common order of operations for certain players to, in order to test all options in this kind of game, to replay the same route up to the last choices within the branch until they've tired it out and move to an earlier branch and test that one out. If a player chooses to act this way with the game's ending, as you can hopefully see on screen, they will be sorely disappointed and might get a wrong impression, and be discouraged from trying seemingly small options more than once, which is something the game never meant to tell the player with its mechanics. And when I look again at the narrator's final dialogue, I can't help but feel like this is more cut content, or at least say that this feels like it lacks direction and context when put into comparison with the really surprising consistency within other endings for narrator and player roles and context of dialogue. Yeah, he's talking to himself, but this raises more very valuable questions that I feel like don't fit the other questions the game doesn't answer, like where are your coworkers or whatever. Questions such as, who is hearing this? Surely not the player, because he had addressed the player as Stanley throughout the ending, and even though Stanley is clearly a video game character, and that this Stanley has thoughts and experiences far beyond choices, which he can express in the rating system. So if he's talking to himself like is implied, and I also think he is, how can we hear this? This narrator is clearly not wherever Stanley is, down there, so who are we hearing this? And how did we get access to hearing the narrator again? It's actually not a possibility to argue that the developer just put you or whatever your conscience is near the narrator because the narrator is the developer in this ending. I don't think these are the kinds of questions that should rise from an ending in any way, even though these might have an answer much later. This is also one of the 2 times in the entire game you are separated from Stanley and get to hear the narrator speak to an entity that is not you and isn't thin air. We will discuss the other instance far later, and I think it isn't very related, but for now I want to examine another ending because I feel like I started off a bit too negative. That said, it is an issue in my opinion that one of the game's first ending is a mess unlike anything else in the game that is considered finished. I do genuinely love this game, but this video isn't just meant to be an appraising piece. As much as I have the ability to make one, and I feel like mentioning this again and again would be pointless, so if you're new to these types of videos, I want to establish the obvious for a second and say that a negative observation doesn't translate directly to how I feel about the game. I would still give the game a meaningless 5 out of 5 because I recommend it to anyone, but this video is just an analytic overview and critique, not saying I didn't enjoy the game, I absolutely did, and you will too. With that worry off my chest, let's continue to the more reasonable first ending of the game, the freedom ending. This is the ending players, fully playing in the role of Stanley, achieve for following the narrator's story step by step. I don't see much reason to provide an overview of the conflicts raised in this ending, and well, that's what's beautiful about it. I applaud how much work was put into making this story as unappealing as humanly possible to any real person. Not only is the player presented 4 big glowing opposite choices in the form of the 2 doors, the staircase, the escape corridor, and the facility power room. Before each of those big clearly impactful choices, you will follow in the narrative's footsteps. You can also explore 2 areas of interest, where you have many things to look at but nothing to impact. You start in an office area where you can look around, go for another one, and then are faced with the 2 doors. Then you enter the densely packed meeting room where I might not ever find something new I haven't read on the walls yet, and the broom closet, which is, you know what it is. After those 2, you go up the staircase by instructions and you see one big area of interest separated into reception, boss office, and elevator back room. After that, you see the giant escape sign to the left of the mind control facility, in which you go through the confusing and wondrous monitor room showcase, and when you go above that, a room full of colorful and new buttons that you can press but do nothing with. And then you are met with the final, very obviously impactful choice to turn the mind controls off. This pacing injects the player with curiosity they can't do anything with in between the meaningful choices, and just makes them itching to make an impact on this weird world eventually. There is nearly no appeal to following instructions your first time through the game. It's usually a player's second or later run where they see that happy ending where Stanley is led to freedom. That said, I find it particularly charming that even though you allegedly found your freedom in the freedom ending, right after the narrator says that nobody will tell Stanley what to do, you are then commanded to keep playing as Stanley would and step in through the open door, where the control from Stanley is literally taken away from you, and it's up to you to decide if this implies that you completely lost control to the game or actually freed Stanley from your own control. Either way, I find this closure to be brilliant, and I'm sure it's by design. In Luke Dog 3-1's own wonderful analysis of the game, which will be linked in the description, one of the smartest things he points out is this.
The ending where the player follows everything the narrator tells them to do is actually the happiest one. It's the most satisfying and the only one with an actual true ending. Although the narrator can seem hostile from time to time, he is not GLaDOS from Portal. He actually just wants to bring Stanley, or the player, along for a small ride and make their day better.
This is a key claim as it's consistently true at its core throughout the entire game, and every conflict presented is because of that. The narrator wanted the best for you, and the only reason all the other endings are technically bad in a moral, not technical way, is because the player had chosen to go against the goodwill of the narrator. Even though the insanity ending and the confusion ending, which we will discuss later, are ones where it's not as obviously revolving around this conflict, they still followed this idea in one way or the other. I have nothing to connect this to just yet, but I'll come back to this point multiple times as actual conflicts rise from this in other endings. And now, to branch off into the next few endings, I want to emphasize the importance of how the player is referred to in this game, and the concept of roles in general in the game, which I mentioned earlier, but especially in this ending, where they are not referred to at all. This is the only ending, aside from the coward ending, where the entire story is about Stanley in a third person. Stanley is never talked to directly at any point during the freedom ending, even when you disobey one option if you choose to take the right door in the first major area. This is important because at any time you choose to turn right in these two doors, you are dismissed as Stanley, still following the narrative story, just in your own small diversion. This makes sense since the player is totally able to turn back to the standard platform here by turning left and continuing into the meeting room, so the story feels natural if one were to follow all orders from that point. It would be awkward if after taking the right door, the narrator would say something in the vein of, "Stanley, I'm afraid you missed my mark, you were supposed to go left. Please hurry back to the maintenance section so we can continue the story," and after that kind of line, he won't ever talk directly to Stanley again. Instead, the narrator seems to try and keep improvising and adapting his script to fit your actions, and never refers to Stanley himself in these lines. In fact, even during this broom closet sub-dialogue, the narrator skips from describing Stanley in third person straight to discussing the player's choices and decisions, informing the real player that they have nothing to do here, that there's no ending to tell their friends about, and later presuming they are dead, but this does not influence Stanley or talks to him. Any way you reach the freedom ending can be imagined as if Stanley himself has never heard a word of what was spoken. And now I want to examine the importance of when the game breaks the semi-immersive appeal it built around Stanley, and not specifically the player, but the times Stanley is talked to. For example, if and when the player pushes on through the corridor and doesn't get back on track, the game is now free to question either the player or Stanley's choices. This is a great turning point the game makes. The player is finally feeling like their disobedience is truly affecting how the narrator acts, as he shows frustration in spite of Stanley making a choice that had now fully ruined any chance of his original story being told, now that the door back into the meeting room had closed off, and the game now has to continue without its intended story. The next few endings will be discussed in a lighter detail since they all have interesting points at which the narrator drops the third-person narrator approach when faced with disobedience that can be undone. I'll go over these quickly, but just know that they are meant to be looked at in a similar light. The death ending is extremely simple, although I consider the very last line of it to be rather interesting. This ending is also common as player's first ending, as it's another way to keep your disobedience from the narrator going on your first run. After not going through the door on the left twice towards the meeting room, the narrator still hasn't broken for the formula of only speaking in third person and only about Stanley. He claims that Stanley was so bad at following directions that incredibly wasn't fired years ago. In the death ending, where you simply drop either off the platform or from the ground before it, the narrator says one last line about Stanley, and then, fully with the knowledge that there's no point keeping the third person narrator appearance alive, he says directly to Stanley, "Good job, Stanley. Everyone thinks you are very powerful." It's a fair time to break the perspective, as if the narrator just realized how soon the game and story would reset and feels a need to scold Stanley not to repeat behavior. It's logical. I would also like to say that the cold feet ending, where you rush back off the platform to the ground in fear, is also a fitting time to break the narration sequence. The narrator is clearly meant to be quite annoyed here, and him breaking the third person barrier and start to mock Stanley's cowardice just before the game will surely be over, talking directly to him, is very fitting. The explosion ending is one of my favorites in its tone and presentation. To reach it, the player must go along with every choice up until the moment he is given the chance to free himself and everyone he knows for good, but instead chooses to turn the mind controller powers on under his hand. Allegedly. The narrator immediately breaks from whatever distance there was between him and Stanley and starts berating Stanley for nearly 40 seconds, and clearly implying he is a storyteller with a script ready for whatever happens, as he tells Stanley he'd love the next part of his story before going back to third person for one more line.
For example, and I believe you'll find this pertinent, Stanley suddenly realized he had just initiated the network's emergency detonation system. In the event that this machine is activated without proper DNA identification, nuclear detonators are set to explode, eliminating the entire complex.
After this line, the narrator goes on a phenomenal GLaDOS-like speech about how silly was it of Stanley to think that this was his story, as the player probably struggles hurrying from button to button to try and aimlessly solve this room with no answers. The narrator mocks Stanley for thinking that they have any power. In fact, he goes so far as to say that he doesn't always tell the story this way. Sometimes, instead of this, the building is destroyed or put on fire, or sometimes Stanley is locked in his room and dies alone. This isn't a lie from the narrator, even though it might seem as if he's implying that he chooses what happens. What the narrator is actually doing is citing off various options from his script. There is a running theme in the game that the narrator has a script ready for every decision. The script is audibly heard or is referred to in the start of the confusion ending.
Let's see, we went down.
The beginning of the free choice ending.
Let me double check. No, it's definitely here, clear as day.
The diversion into the beginning of the Zending.
Now listen carefully, this is important. Stanley walked through the red door.
And the explosion ending, as seen here. At all the mentioned times, the narrator is preparing Stanley to follow an order from the script. This ending is all about the script, and is really where it's established most clearly in the game, although it's quite a given from playing it yourself, that the Stanley Parables ending do not signal an end. They are meant to be looked at together as an ongoing experience called the Stanley Parable. The end is never the end. This is another ending that for a majority of its runtime does not stray from the idea of a third-person narrator telling the player Stanley's story. In fact, even though it's not an early choice like taking the right door but an ending's beginning, going downstairs is not something the narrator finds as an issue. He flows to whatever his script had to say about this option and starts narrating Stanley's descent into madness as he loops around these 4 or 5 rooms. However, there is a particularly fascinating moment here during this descent where the narrator, well, it's best to just play it.
And then perhaps the strangest question of them all entered Stanley's head. One he was amazed he hadn't asked himself sooner. Why is there a voice in my head dictating everything that I'm doing and thinking?
So now, the idea is that the narrator, whom we have been listening to all along, was also either heard by Stanley as well as us, or that we, the players, are listening to Stanley's mind constantly, or at least to his sense of hearing. Which one is it? Well, even though it's more common to assume we share the human side of the character we control in a game, as the latter option implies, I'm pretty sure it would be more troublesome than to believe Stanley simply hears the narration in addition to the player, who will not be affected if Stanley didn't hear the narrator. This would also somewhat explain the gaming ending's final monologue, but more significantly, the museum narrator, the free choice ending, and obviously, Mariella. After traveling the repeating corridors as the narrator reads out Stanley's descent into madness, Stanley's vision goes black. The screen fades back into a static moment in time, depicting Stanley's body dead on a sidewalk with a woman named Mariella in a moment of confusion. The narrator describes her side of the encounter, the brief thoughts in her head for a split second before she runs away in panic from the dead, insane man on the ground. Mariella is a special thing in this game. It's the only time the story implies so many things at once that I think it's very obvious that I shouldn't treat the rest of the game as another version of it, but instead that this is one of the many varying versions of the plot with another design. The freedom ending clearly doesn't make sense with the Mariella implications that Stanley's a mentally troubled person hallucinating and running around town screaming to himself. This is just one of the narrator's scripts he has ready for the select choices he prepared for. Because of this, I think the Mariella ending is more of a face value one, and it simply stands very, very strongly on its own. From this point, I think the endings start to become very significant. So far, every ending has been nothing but a simple gag on player choices, merged with another storyline that the narrator somewhat expects. We have 5 more endings to discuss throughout this video, so hopefully you gathered something so far because we have quite a lot left. The endings remaining are quite possibly the most interesting and most troublesome endings in regards to the question that led me to even begin work on this video. What is the Stanley Parable supposed to be, who is it for, and what does it try to lead you to think? I'm not saying it necessarily has some deeper meaning about our everyday lives or that it is about the creator themselves, as if you have played the beginner's guide you'd know I shouldn't ever imply such case. My question is simply what is the closing thought I should leave the Stanley Parable with, and the remaining 5 endings, when weighing in the ones I've already discussed, raise many varying issues that I can't wait to finally get to, so I'll stop the sequence now. The 5 endings left are the confusion ending, the museum ending, the apartment ending, the free choice ending, and the out of bounds ending. One may interpret the out of bounds ending as 2 separate ends because of the choice within it, but I'll discuss them as one because they serve an identical purpose with a different tone. But we'll get to that later. For now, I want to take a sharp look at the apartment ending. As he previously pointed out, the narrator wanted the best for Stanley in his story and reached a sort of tipping point after he realizes you passed the chance to go with his story and entered the storage warehouse with no way back, and he gets somewhat upset. When you get onto the moving platform in this room, the narrator begins to try and convince you that he really is rooting for you. This idea is carried on through every path you take from here, except the one the narrator is going for. If you keep disobeying in various ways to his attempts to redeem his ideals, the narrator will continue claiming he wanted the best all along. But if you do end up following his instructions on the moving platform, you are led to what is nothing short of psychological torture for Stanley. Remember, up until this point, you, the player, has not been addressed during this route. Up until the platform, Stanley wasn't even talked to, but now the narrator has changed his focus from telling a story to talking to Stanley himself. He leads Stanley into a dark room with a single phone ringing, waiting to be picked up. Picking up the phone is the beginning of the apartment ending, where the narrator says one last line directed to Stanley in second person, although the rest of what he says is clearly meant to be heard by Stanley, as the narration continues as a speech meant to shame and poke fun at Stanley's life, and the speech only advances if you continue following various prompts on the screen to push buttons. Obviously, this is a reference to Stanley's own job. You don't need to move during this ending, only push the buttons that come on screen. After 9 of these prompts, each one replacing a part of this apartment back into what Stanley's office looked like, the narrator shows that he is also aware of the prompts, perhaps even controlling them, as he says this.
And I'm trying to tell him this, that in this world he can never be anything but an observer, that as long as he remains here, he's slowly killing himself, but he won't listen to me. He won't stop. Here, watch this. Stanley, the next time the screen asks you to push a button, do not do it.
So what happens now? You can choose to not push the button, like you were asked to. Your life will stop reverting back to the office. You will take control. You will stop this. You, the player, have all the power in the world to stop this. This is not a real option, is it? It's for a video game. And the narrator is seemingly so unaware of the fact that Stanley is controlled by a real person that the entire point of his speech is that Stanley is unable to act on his own desires. He is conceptually unaware that Stanley is in fact actually not in control, but instead under a player's limited literal controls of keyboard and mouse or control. This ending is full of pressure and guilt, but the player will never not go through it in its entirety. No player going through the Stanley Parable will ever choose to quit the game on the first time seeing this ending to prove a point. The human desire to be correct isn't a driving motive when the other argument is clearly a preset collection of code and not someone who can learn from their action. The narration will just stop. It won't react and congratulate Stanley on his powerful decision. It will just stop. The will to see content in a video game is so much more powerful than the will to be ethically correct, and I feel like a really good example is Toby Fox's own take on the idea of quitting. So, spoiler alert for the kill everything route of Undertale. Please skip forward to the timestamp titled, after Undertale Spoilers in the description or the pinned comment if you haven't already figured out who I'm going to be bringing up. Yup, it's him. In the battle against Sans, which is as a whole a beautiful showcase of meta-narrative done right, one of his lines fits in so well with the issue I brought up right now about how the Stanley Parable expects you to quit to be correct when he says the following. You'll never give up, even if there's absolutely no benefit to persevering whatsoever. No matter what, you'll just keep going, not out of any desire for good or evil, but just because you think you can. And because you can, you have to. This quote right here is extremely relevant to this idea in the apartment ending of players experiencing something terrible which they totally disagree with and not easily fighting back for no clear motive. When I first understood this dilemma that's supposed to take place but never does, I thought the Stanley Parable doesn't account for the fact that players don't actually care for choices but content. Players will not usually quit a game to take a stand, except when they are driven away and convinced that they should keep trying, which is the whole point of the Sans fight, to actually motivate the player to quit. Sans uses all of his strength in order to make sure you have absolutely zero motivation to keep going, advance the plot, and destroy the world. Sans is a real boss. He simply doesn't want you to advance, no matter how good you are. He doesn't give up, he falls asleep. He's not meant to serve a challenge. He wants to protect his world. I don't want to go too much into detail on this, but I do plan to maybe eventually do a complete review and commentary of Undertale piece by piece, so I guess that topic will be included there. That's it for the Undertale spoilers. Welcome back. The concept of quitting or resetting the game is simply something I thought the game didn't consider enough when making it the center of the apartment ending under the subtext of the dialogue. The idea that Stanley, controlled by the player, doesn't have a choice but to keep going, until I looked a bit deeper into the confusion ending, which once just appeared to me as nothing but a long gag on a troubled narrator, and after taking my time and looking deeper into the various scenes within it, now seems to me like one of the wildest artistic inclusions of this game, if what I think it tries to do is actually the developer's intention. The confusion ending is probably many people's favorite. It's hilariously well written, filled with memorable moments, and takes a very long time, and its closure has a very lasting impact on the player's expectations for the next run or even two. And the fact that this ending is so memorable and loved is actually really weird to me, because for a reason I found really hard to accept personally, it lacks everything the rest of the game has. Choice. The beginning of this ending is so early in its runtime that I think watching someone else play through this ending will have actually no difference than playing it yourself. Something I really can't say for many other endings. The reason this happened, that this ending is not controlled by the player or Stanley at all, is that it's no longer about them, but the narrator. I already said this, and I'm sure I'm not surprising anyone by stating that the Stanley Parable is not about Stanley. The Stanley Parable is about the collective experience the player has as they're making various decisions and observations about their conflicts with the narrator. This is true for every single ending in the entire game, except for the confusion ending. This ending is not only lacking choices, but any player-narrator conflict. Many Let's Players and streamers I've watched playing this ending will try to raise a conflict near the start of it, trying to, jokingly want to go for the outer doors before just playing along, but as it goes on for longer and longer, they just kind of give in and don't even bother themselves with wanting choices, they're just interested in what's going to come next in this existing confusing plotline. The replacement for all those things the rest of the endings have is a new type of conflict, narrator versus game. This is a new concept, but unlike the Mariella ending, where I could throw the ending away as a special case where it's just a told story in the script, this ending is confusing, as the name may imply. Let's start the proper overview and I'll clarify this special case later, but do know in advance that this ending is best looked at with a focus on the narrator's choices. The beginning of the confusion ending is marked when entering the maintenance elevator in the corridor from the employee lounge back to the meeting room. This in concept means that the player chose to disobey the narrator once, and the next time to listen to him in an attempt to make up for the first disobedience, and then casually dismissing the order to walk forward and went down the elevator. This to me seems like an instance where the narrator is caught off guard and was not ready for Stanley to go down the elevator at all. When you go down this elevator shaft, the narrator will begin to quickly mention Stanley is wandering off track, away from the story, and then when he tries directing Stanley the right way, he stumbles, seemingly not having the right script at the ready. He even breaks the third-person perspective quite early, not only correcting himself and opening doors, but asking the player, who in this ending is referred to as Stanley, to hold on while he rustles his papers in a very direct manner. After finding what is certainly the next step from here, Stanley follows along, only to find the television room from under the boss's office, already lit up and activated, spoiling the surprise from a later point in the narrator's story. In this path, the narrator was sure just a moment ago that the story will be told properly and has no grudge against Stanley. He doesn't know what to do, so he resorts to restarting the game. I let my dad play through the game, and he went through this ending. Now, he doesn't know English as fluently as me, but he definitely understood the game and what just happened, and he called me into the room to ask what the hell was that ending after the restart. I had to tell him myself to continue playing so he understood that the reset was part of the ongoing plot, and while going forward, even without asking someone what the hell just happened, I want to share this experience because I think it's a good example of how unexpected the option of resetting a game is. While by the second restart anyone will understand that, okay, something is not in line, I'm in the process of an ending, which is the idea the closure of this ending plays on, I do think it's important to point out that even my dad, who has no real expectations from games aside from having played Doom about 30 years ago and isn't used to any tropes or perceptions on games, even he knew that a restart should mark the end of progress for a player. This is what I was talking about in the apartment ending, that restarting early invokes a feeling of missing content. Even though the narrator clearly changes what doors open and which don't, he is, as the game establishes often enough, the one who decides it's better to restart and see if anything improves. After this, the very first choice you can make usually is malfunctioning. Well, that's inaccurate, but any other earlier choice you could make was disabled, such as closing your office door. Anyway, the player and the narrator reach the room meant for the 2 open doors, and they are surprised to find 6 open doors leading to varying corridors. The narrator stumbles for a moment before deciding to drop whatever the script might have intended to do here and let Stanley and him make their own adventure through choice. Entering any of the rooms will soon enough lead the player to understand all doors simply lead to long, connected and endless corridors. And the narrator too steps in and decides to cut this experiment early on and decides that instead of making sure that there is no way forward, it's better to simply restart the game over yet again. Now that the player understands something is up with these restarts, they are likely to rush to the 2 doors room where there are now no doors at all. Now weirdness begins to impact, as when you and the narrator check back where you came from, the beginning is replaced with a blue corridor. Inside this corridor is the blue corridor. Inside that is the blue corridor, where inside that there is a nice desk. Going back through the impossible corridors reveals you never came from the office, but there was actually a room with wooden walls and a disagree button. One way or the other, this is when the confusion in the name sets in. The non-Euclidean layout of the office, which was used already in the last restart, begins to set in as the impossibility of the world gets more and more confusing. The narrator tries making up a win state just for fun, admits it wasn't worth the effort, and restarts and brings it yet another new entity to this world, the adventure line. There is little to say about the adventure line in a way of analyzing it from my perspective, aside from possibly questioning the nature of its existence, but while I'm on my way there, let's talk about the journey and the destination. This entire ending is framed around the narrator looking for his story while carrying Stanley along for when they find it, since after all the story being sought after is going to be about Stanley, that much is certain. However, the narrator goes off on an incredibly annoying blabble on your first time through, which I really love. I think the idea of confusing the player with the weird wavings of the line after the impossible geometry, well, during it as well, and the high language ramblings while you can barely process where you're taken is hilarious. However, it would be a mistake to dismiss it as entirely blabber for the sake of blabber. Considering this entire video I'm making here already has a far more serious tone than the game itself, I think now will be a good opportunity for many of you to listen closely to what the narrator is saying.
Though, here's a thought. Wouldn't wherever we end up be our destination, even if there's no story there? Or to put it another way, is the story of no destination still a story? Simply by the act of moving forward, are we implying a journey such that a destination is inevitably conjured into being via the very manifestation of the nature of life itself? Okay, Stanley, I need to follow this train of thought for a minute. Just stick with me.
The narrator asks if wouldn't wherever you two end up will be the destination no matter what, due to being a story, or if a story of no end is still a story. He then develops the former idea and asks if the very act of moving forward through the corridors counts as a journey, and considering we just established that wherever you end up will be the destination, is a destination created due to the nature of journeys? I would like to continue as if this was a discussion and to answer to whoever wrote that part of the script that no, the act of moving forward won't create the destination, but the act of stopping movement and or claiming the journey is complete is the only thing that can mark a destination as one except conceptually. Assuming the destination wasn't clarified specifically in advance, in which case stopping a movement is only part of a journey or a failure of the journey. If I didn't first tell myself I was heading to climb to the top of a mountain, that would not invalidate the top of the mountain's existence, and the other way around, telling myself that I am going to be swimming in the middle of the desert would not make a destination related to the journey. It would simply cause the destination to be wherever my chin hits the sand. And while I'm already here, I would also like to ask why the next line didn't make as much sense as this. If anyone can understand what the next line means or tries to make me think about, contact me immediately and I will contact the authorities.
Now we can both agree that the nature of existence is in fact a byproduct of one's subjective experience of that existence, right? Okay, now if my experience of your existence rests inside of your subjective experience of this office, is this office in fact the skeleton of my own relative experiential mental subjective construct?
Some more adventuring entails until the line leads the two right back to the spoilery monitor room, where the narrator wastes no time and restarts once again with no plan ready in advance. This is the final reset of the run, in which the narrator shows he is still controlling the office, more specifically doors within it, as before you get a chance to follow the line again, he closes the door shut and opens a new one, allowing Stanley and him to travel on their own adventure, much like they attempted already. It's important to notice how the narrator has significantly more power than the player, and this reset shows it more than any other. The reason this doesn't bother the players, imagine if the player had choices within this ending leading to this point. I'm sure they'll notice much more clearly how oddly monumental it is to show the narrator closing a door and opening a new one 6 resets into a world that still doesn't give him what he wants, but still under his influence. You may see where I'm going with this. In the next scene, in which the narrator gets to make another choice, far more clearly choosing between 2 open doors, well, they're not open for us, and even though the narrator can open the doors and look, he much more enjoys trying to make sense and logic out of choosing between a 50-50 choice. This bit of dialogue right here might be the funniest joke in the game, at least in my opinion. Enjoy my visualization to help understand how funny this line of thought is.
Ah, a choice. We get to make a decision. From here, the story is in our control. How important we mustn't squander the opportunity. In fact, I believe I need a minute to think here. Just walk in circles for a minute. Okay, so I know that each door has to lead somewhere, which means that somewhere, the place where we're trying to go, there must be a reverse door that leads here. And that in turn means that our destination corresponds with the counter-inverted reverse door's origin. So starting from the right, let us ask, will taking the right door lead us to where we're going? And since the answer is clearly yes, then by all accounts, the door on the right is the correct one. Another victory for logic. Come, Stanley, our destiny awaits.
Regardless of how brilliant this joke is, the narrator only opens the door he chose on the right, and you two step into the heart of the operation, the confusion ending schedule. This is what I mentioned earlier about how I can't disregard this as the narrator's story like Mariella. In that case, I assume the Mariella plot is simply the narrator's script. But this details a whole other idea. The narrator doesn't know the script or the schedule. In fact, unlike the rest of the game, once the narrator fumbles with his papers, aside from the two first resets where the narrator hopes the game might have been fixed and tries to play his role as usual, the narrator doesn't read a single line from the script like the rest of the game. All he does is talk directly to Stanley as they move along. Also, while I don't think the narrator is Stanley or that they are the same entity in this ending whatsoever, it seems as if their knowledge is shared or the same. While the narrator can employ the help of the line and open doors, he doesn't know anything Stanley doesn't know as well. Once Stanley went down the maintenance elevator, the narrator seemingly lost his script and is at the mercy of only things Stanley can see and know. And the narrator had all the options the player did in addition to his own, even restarting the game or not. Remember what I said earlier about how I thought the act of making the apartment ending only end well if the player quits was unreasonable to expect of players and a possible oversight? Well, it isn't. It's part of another plotline. In this scenario, the narrator makes the exact choice I described as nonsensical of quitting the game to take a stand and for their own good. Of course, the player who wants to see what happens more than they want to be correct doesn't do that kind of thing, but the narrator lives in this world. He will be affected for all he cares about. By this schedule, he doesn't want to see the content that's in the other restarts the narrator does. He makes not just the decision to open a door, not just the decision between two doors, he chooses to quit the game. He quits the script he did not agree to, that possibly wasn't even given to him. He has to face the cold truth that video games don't let you choose what to do, but only choose which of a set number of options you want to perform. One of them is quitting the game, and that's what the narrator does. And now the game acts as if it was reset by the player or naturally after an ending, but many players will spend this true reset expecting the schedule to continue, making it so impactful and memorable. Now, I originally thought it might make more sense to cover this ending after the free choice ending and the museum ending due to how obscure it is, but both seem like they complicate a lot within themselves so much that I'd rather just cover the issue discussed in this ending before the other two at all. I will use the first time I bring up this ending to introduce a dilemma raised by the game's narrative in this ending, and will come back to analyze it again when that question fires back at itself as I find meaning in this ending's existence within and as a medium of communication. For now, let's look at what happens after you reach this ending's beginning by exiting the window near Stanley's office. I'm skipping the fact that you had to get to this ending because it isn't relevant yet. Once you get to the bottom, after a few seconds of possibly feeling like you outsmarted the game greets you and says, nope, this is still all intended. The narrator continues with one additional line in the third-person narration ideal before not referring to Stanley by name ever again and just talking directly to him, but there is clear implication that he is talking more to a player than to a Stanley in this dialogue. Shortly afterwards, the player is asked whether or not they are sick of whatever joke the narrator is going for in this section. Even though this choice affects everything else in this ending, I don't think there's reason to give the two options different names or define them as different endings. I think it's best to make a special case and just say that the ending has two small paths. I say that because I think both endings present the same exact ideas in respective ways to whatever you said about being sick of this gag. If you answer that no, you are not sick of this gag yet, the narrator expands on the line of thought of the very question and ponders what would have happened to the player if they had chosen to say that they are sick of this gag, if the same dialogue as whatever is being told right now will repeat but retrofitted to match that answer, and wonders if it's worth it for the player to restart and come back and try again, seeing that this whole jam takes a fair amount of time, and maybe the other option is even more of a time sink for the player. He then toys with the idea that the player had just came back from the other ending, and after more blabber, leaves the player forever to ponder all the possibilities. If you answer that you are sick of this gag, the narrator gets immediately and fairly justifiably flustered and confused by the mere idea of answering this. He points out the very shocking truth that if they are actually that tired of it, they wouldn't have even been here, but instead loading the map again. Every single second the player doesn't quit is a mark of shame and proof that they cannot act on their own desires. The narrator then chooses to revel in this conflict the player had put themselves in, and since there is no good option for the player but to reset, he would continue to make the other option of staying truly miserable. He goes on a song to shame Stanley, and the music loops forever.
And if you are not strong and keep playing along, you too will become quite unbearable. Yes. You too will become quite unbearable.
In neither of these endings does the game restart on its own like in most other ones. This is new. While even though I presented it as the ethical options, most players will say the apartment ending wouldn't quit because they have content lying in front of them. This time, quitting the game is required, but you run into the risk of possibly missing content. It's the reverse issue. Nothing rules out the in-game possibility that waiting in the white void for 10 minutes would make the narrator talk again. The player is risking missing out on content in a game they have purchased and invested time into, since they aren't capped off from content at any point, by virtue of an automatic reset points that tell them that's all the content, you don't need to keep waiting here, like my dad expected at the end of the first Confusion ending restart. In fact, if you think about it, the story itself has multiple endings in which the last action taken is someone within the game deciding to wait forever, but after that decision, the game resets on its own, implying that those people will never stop waiting and telling the video game player that there is no more content in that waiting time.
The end will be here soon. Very soon. I can wait.
That's all right. I'll wait for you to decide what's the right thing to do. Take as much time as you need.
But of course, the game is well aware that it's playing dirty by making you risk losing content. In fact, this is the entire narrative path of these two choices within one ending. How much will you sacrifice for content? Now will be the best time to finally get to talking about the Zending, as it's basically the most surface level dilemma raised throughout the entire game in my opinion. It can be summed up as a very straightforward presentation of the conflict in the Out of Bounds ending, and a very long-lasting execution of the action taken in the Death ending. The conflict of the player sacrificing Stanley to receive more content from the good-willing narrator. Here's how the ending is set up, step by step. You deny the narrator, deny him 20 more by falling onto the platform, and then have 3 opportunities to finally listen to him as he tries to prove he wants the best for you. Taking any of the 3 opportunities leads to this zen, beautiful light show of a room with relaxed ambient music, and beside it, a grey, hollow cement room with a long, stretching, tall staircase, from which the player can drop to the floor far below, damaging Stanley and as a result, eventually killing him and restarting the game. The alternative is doing nothing in a beautiful room. There's no deeper meaning to draw here. It's actually a step down from other endings in its subtlety and complexity. It's simply bringing the conflict of sacrifice in order to seek content to a literal and unexciting end. Either not see content or see content, but wrapping those two options in the meanings in literal terms of sacrifice and content. Anyway, about this ending, if you want a more appreciative take on it than mine, Game Studios Lee's video about happiness in the Stanley Parable covers it in a much more complete way, and it's definitely worth a watch. So, you may have noticed that so far, in order to get every ending but the freedom ending, there was a motive of curiosity and experimentation. You, the player, had willingly and knowingly sacrificed the idea of a good ending in order to see new content the game is likely to offer you. But in nearly every single time you've done so, you have been told either to not do things for no reason, to follow the story, and that your choice is what led to this negative circumstance. Which is correct, but there's an issue with calling any of these situations the player's fault. That issue is the idea that content put inside a game that only occurs if you do something is meant to be seen by default. Here's a wonderful quote by Folding Ideas' video on the Stanley Parable, Dark Souls, and intended play at 6:13.
What a game intends for you to do includes not only the things the fiction of the game tells you to do, but also the broader things the game permits you to do. If there is something that the game's author simply flat out 100% did not want you to experience, did not want you to engage in, then it wouldn't be there. The only truly accurate sign that the authors don't want you doing that is that nothing happens at all. This is because even a negative reaction, even the game pushing back against misbehavior, is content.
So, the conclusion I can draw from this is that there are now two ways to interpret the game's various negative responses. One is the one where you are told by the game that your choices don't matter and are bad for you. This is what I'll refer to as game context, where I simply take the words spoken at face value. The other option is to consider everything as content, and the act of pushing back is to content that by its sheer existence promotes the act of continuing to push back against the game in new places to receive more content. This is what I'll refer to as out-of-game context, because when looked at as a game with content and options, and not looked at the game's plot and implications about whatever it says it is, in this case those very options and content, which is irrelevant, and instead saying that if it's in the game and it's a programmed response, it's supposed to be there. Even the art ending, which I originally planned to exclude from this, is content meant to be seen, just much less than any other ending. It's a chore for the sake of a chore, but it still follows this ruling. I'm sorry if this was complicated, it is for me as I'm writing the script and hey, now reading it. But I hope, however I chose to visualize this helped. Simply put, what I just established is that according to the Out of Bounds ending, you are meant to find every ending and bit of dialogue in the Stanley Parable by virtue of it being in the game and implemented into a playable option. I consider the Serious Room to be a small Easter egg for those who deny it, and at least lets the player know that aside from this room, there is nothing that requires cheats added in by the developer. Unless you treat the Serious Room in the out-of-game context, see what I mean? The act of putting content behind modifying the game in one way at least denies our ability to dismiss the option that even cheating might bar some content. We will return to this later, in a while, trust me. But keep in mind that even though this sounds insane, I know what the hell I'm talking about, but there is value in saying that putting content behind cheats can be interpreted as the game saying that cheats might hide any amount of content. Until I can come back to this, and I'm sorry I'm leaving pieces behind, but I really do need to introduce each concept at its simplest form before I can mash them together later. So for now, I need to cover the museum ending, which is one of the things I've been trying to delay the inevitability of for very long now. Probably nearly an hour. Hopefully you've been keeping up. To reach the museum ending of the Stanley Parable, you need to willingly die. Nothing else, there is no further conflict before and somewhat after the beginning of this ending. After going to the boss's elevator heading towards the mind control facility, the player notices a big white sign to their left with the word escape pointing left, into a long, strange corridor. If the player enters that corridor, they are soon informed that they will die at the end of it. Not that they will squander the story or anything, not that the narrator will be annoyed and respond in a fun way, just that they will die. The dilemma of the player sacrificing everything, including themselves and the current life they live as Stanley, just to see what happens, is all that the player is faced with. No implications, no side jokes, no gags, nothing. It's almost as if the death ending had a build-up as opposed to just happening. Once the player jumps down the pit, the narrator, who had yet to leave the third-person narration facade of the freedom ending, goes on a tragic speech fueled by sheer disappointment and insult due to Stanley's blind ignorance, mocks how little Stanley actually mattered to this world, and breaks the facade at the same time he did in the death ending, and greets Stanley farewell. This is when the ending is completed. You die, and in a few moments you will be back in your office via a restart of the game. But much like all of you watching this have been doing for every other ending so far, the player also doesn't experience this ending by themselves, but rather hears its overview. At the instant the enormous metal jaws hit the short cell Stanley was locked in, mere frames before he is killed, reality freezes. A new voice begins to talk. I will call this voice the meta-narrator, and I will also be using female pronouns when mentioning her because I can't see any wrong in doing so. Meta-narrator refers to Stanley and the player as one and does not talk to Stanley in what she says. She talks to whoever is looking at the Stanley parable a second time in order to examine it. She is talking to the people watching and I guess making videos with titles like Full Narrative Analysis of the Stanley Parable. You can imagine this ending's actual turn of event as an ending that simply killed Stanley, and you, the player, only receive the commentary that meta-narrator provides in this very video by me. But because content identical to what I might have said if that was the way things occurred in the game is already included within the game and provided to presumably everyone who plays the game, I need to change my approach to this, as I don't get to talk about what the game gave commentary on, but rather the commentary itself. This whole ending is structured, in my opinion at least, like a video on YouTube, which is amazing for a game published in 2013. Look at how it's structured. The meta-narrator pauses the footage in a dramatic moment, talks about it, and later cuts back, makes a jump cut, and tries to send a message to the player, as she asks them to quit and stop the conflict between the two. Even I thought naming her the meta-narrator was cheesy, but now that what I practically do here is make a video about an in-game playable video about an ending non-existent in the Stanley Parable due to the existence of this interactive video ending also within the Stanley Parable, yeah, I think this passes as meta. Her narration starts as she describes the irony of the situation. Although the narrator's speech was emotional and Stanley's death was brutal, it will all be quickly brushed off and restarted with no significance on the player as they will continue to lead Stanley to a tragic demise again and again. There is no good ending for Stanley because the game has no end. Remember what I said about the explosion ending, how the Stanley Parable doesn't have different ways to end it? The game called the Stanley Parable is just the experience of all the endings you reach in your playtime. But the meta-narrator makes a very interesting approach here that if she was indeed another YouTube video talking about the game, I'd have an easier time possibly arguing against. But because what she says now is written in the game script and is part of what the game tells you as a whole and not a third-party opinion, I have to take it as something the game, at least using the game context interpretation, is presenting to me as somewhat of a moral of this story, its meaning or what it tries to claim. As you enter the museum, you hear this line.
When every path you can walk has been created for you long in advance, death becomes meaningless, making life the same.
Let me try and understand the stand being taken here. Obviously the idea is that your choices don't matter, but the very first line is a very bold take on this. When everything you can do was made by someone else and not you, when everything you think you affect will still lead to choosing one of many different results someone else made in order to be chosen, then there is no point to seeing it. Death becomes meaningless, making life the same. This line, the idea that not only do you no longer need to care or worry about Stanley's death, but neither should you care about his life. You always die if you play this game, and I'll admit I'm having a rough time accepting this, which I think might be the point. The harshness of this claim and the sheer temperature of the take makes many players dismiss it as they start wandering the museum and forget about it. But this take implies that if you can't affect anything, but instead only see things that were made in order to be seen, what's the reason to play? And that goes against so many things, but I understand the idea. Hard Cuts video titled The Problem with Putting Down the Controller notes this very line in a very different perspective from mine, and also reaches some interesting conclusions, so I recommend checking that video out after this one. Regardless, this implication that not having a choice in a game invalidates experiencing it is really wrong in my opinion. If you want reasons here, I'll put some on screen, whatever. And thus, I think the best approach to this is with the out-of-game context, where I treat this very line as yet another piece of content in a game where I want to see what else it can say. I'd say this would be all the importance we need to give this concept, but the fact you are presented with credits along with this line claiming that from the game's eye, you playing the game is pointless, might drive many players to think that that's the final and absolute message of the game, which I think the fact that developers have agreed on a Reddit Q&A that the museum which contained those credits might have been better fit somewhere else is good evidence that's not the case. As I said, this statement about the museum's location came from a Q&A session on the r/games subreddit and was conducted by the game's two main developers and the narrator, where they somewhat agree with one of the comments saying that the museum might have not been best fit for the impact of the museum ending. I guess we'll call it something else at that point, but regardless, the game's creators somewhat agree that narratively it's best to skip discussing the museum for a better impact of the ending. That might be the case in the Ultra Deluxe version, but right now I simply don't know. This fact would impact the analysis more if there was anything more to talk about within the museum, aside from the idea that it contributes to my assumption that the ending is directed like a video on the game, or a replica of how an interpretation of the game will look, but within the game. What I mean by this is that if my assumption is true, it's quite hilarious to add this kind of content to the video, the interactive video. After you finish wandering the museum, you reach a power switch turned to on titled The Stanley Parable. While I don't think this really delivers the feeling or significance of actually turning off the game, this is obviously a representation of that action, a way to emulate that turning off the game is the solution. If this were in a game that didn't break the fourth wall once, maybe the switch would have seemed more impactful, but there's little hesitation to flicking it off. After this symbolic act, the game seemingly cuts to black before the video cuts back into the metal jaws, where you previously never thought you had a way out but your and Stanley's brutal death. It is here where the meta-narrator tells you, the viewer and player as one, that there is always another way. Another way to end every single ending and stop Stanley's single perpetual death, that is the Stanley Parable whole as an experience, to turn the game off. If you want Stanley to be at peace, you shouldn't even follow the narrator, or not. All you need to do is leave. Which is what I'm doing with this ending. I don't think I have anything else to comment on it during this general overview, and it's finally time to go over the absolutely ridiculous to call true ending, yet still pretty much true ending, of the Stanley Parable. This is the story of an unplugged ringing phone. If you are watching this video with subtitles, assuming I was responsible enough to add them in a timely manner, you may have noticed a reference to this ending has been with parentheses. That is for the obvious reason this choice is absolutely the opposite of a free choice. Let's not waste time here. To get this ending to begin, you must get to the ringing phone on the table, and instead of simply pushing the action button on it to begin the apartment ending, you instead go to the back of the room and unplug the phone. I want to say so much about this, much like exiting the window, but I have to wait if I want to avoid wasting time. After you do this, the narrator lies. He absolutely lies. He starts to read some script description in which Stanley picks up the phone, takes it to his apartment, finds his wife, and the two pledge themselves to one another and live happily ever after. This seems like a bold, weird lie from the narrator because it's not to deceive you, it plays out with the entire rest of the ending as if it was really going to be best for you. Here's what I can try and assume about this weird lie situation. The narrator, in a fit of anger, threw the apartment ending's original script out of the window, and in his desire to spite Stanley for making a choice that denied them both access to the happy ending he so desired, he decided to turn the apartment ending into what we know it as, just as the phone was being picked up. Whether that's right or wrong, none of that matters, because we have bigger issues on our hand. The narrator scrambles to understand how Stanley could have possibly chosen wrong, chosen something that wasn't scripted, something he wasn't ready for, until the narrator realized that this was only possible since Stanley is actually a real person. Much like how I felt about the power switch in the museum ending, this kind of falls flat on delivering the experience of choice. While I can think of a better way to handle this myself, the problem I'm having here is that the nature of this choice existing makes it correct. We clarified this multiple times that if it's in the game, it's intended and nobody is stupid enough to fall for even a second to the idea that this wasn't scripted. This is obvious. If it's a line, it had to be scripted or recorded and put into the game. However, it's obvious that the rest of the ending needed this implication in place, so for the purposes of trying to appreciate what's coming up, I will ignore how somewhat poorly and, well, naturally poorly executed really the implication was, and pretend it really was my incorrect choice. Let's simply continue. The narrative scurries you along back into the first choice you did, the two doors room, and slowly in a comically slightly panicked voice explain to you how all you need to do is just act like Stanley. The picture running in my head as I'm writing this is some wedding photographer trying to pose his clients, trying to make it all go just perfect. That seems to be the attitude the narrator is conveying. He just wants everything to go right and be done with it. If you only played this ending 1 or 2 times, you might have not noticed the unique scenario you were forced to deal with in this two-door situation. You are forced to experience two choices. This is the second time since the meta-narrator forced you to quit the game in the museum ending where you canonically experience two endings at once. I'll say what I think about this when I finish talking about both of them. Now that the game knows that your choices are meaningful, going for the right door is clearly impossible, and the game can't handle that. The game, probably being somewhat manifested by the narrator, can no longer account for wrong choices now that he knows he isn't dealing with Stanley, or perhaps a Stanley, but instead a real person. The game glitches out. It's like it was divided by zero, and when you are rushed to choose better, the entire world will begin deteriorating. The narrator becomes purely enraged. Not only has this real person destroyed his story, this entire world in which his story is told is now going to be destroyed as well. Or at least damaged such that no story can be told. There is no barrier between the narrator and Stanley to be confused over. Stanley does not exist. He is not part of this ending in anyone's opinion. The player had made a choice outside of his role. Nobody is playing as Stanley. The actor broke the act. It's as if the main performer in a play just started to senselessly improvise and change characters. There would be simply no point for any of the other actors to stick to their lines, as that would make no sense. But in that kind of scenario, we have real people who can react. There may be scenarios where improvising can work well in a play. However, video games simply aren't programmed for that. Again, while the implication was lousy, the setting we are experiencing is a game that was broken. But what if the narrator had noticed that his game was broken? What if a real-time reactive game was inflicted with video game bugs? That's the scenario presented along this ending. The setup for this might not convey that feeling well, but that's the trope being subverted here. If you want to hear someone talk more about the game's approach to video game tropes and subversion of them, but not just the surface level gaming industry commentary, Theoretical Artist's own over an hour long analysis of the game is really wonderful video on the subject, and also discusses things the game didn't have that it could have had, which is something I don't really do. I only discuss things that are already in the game, so that's worth a listen. So, after more murmuring with the narrator, he attempts to shut the game down. Which works well for Stanley, but simply that is not the case. The actor isn't Stanley by any stretch of the imagination anymore, and isn't affected by the restart. This leaves us in a weird scenario where the narrator is just stuck in a game as it's shutting down, unloading. The narrator goes wild. He is engulfed with rage. He yells at the player for destroying his work, wildly ruining someone else's hard investment until something else happens.
And been victorious. It would have been so perfect. I worked so hard on it. I tried so hard. Behave exactly as Stanley would. That means
this is what I said earlier about this being another element of playing two choices with one ending. You are sent back into the two doors room. If you go back to the right and try and see what happens, you're cut back to this choice again. If you want, you can do this forever. What I think is really going on here is, much like the force used by the meta-narrator in the video, what's happening here is that someone is reloading a save to try a choice again and again to see all their outcomes. You, the player, are no longer in control anyway. In fact, you're just controlling Stanley, but you're not Stanley. The narrator never talked to you in this ending. He was talking to a real person. That's why the game wasn't shut down when you were inside it. You're not the real person being sent out of the game. You're stuck as Stanley, not in control in this game as it's unloading and whizzing until you were reloaded into the two doors room. We'll keep talking about this in a second, but let's cover the left door path as well. When taking the door on the left before messing up on the right, the world is fine as is, but the manager's office is seemingly in a Stanley-less state. It's more directed for the operation of a real person. Thus, instead of a code on the keypad, a simple voice-activated door is bringing the truth to this world. All you need to do, a real person, is to talk into the receiver. If you've played Portal 2, you've actually been through this joke once. There's obviously no actual way to speak in the game. You can't talk into the receiver, there's no correct input here. You, filling the role of Stanley, can't do anything, because if Stanley was here, he would listen and play along and say the code. You can't do this with your limited moveset, as I'll call it. It's the most technical term I can. The narrator, wanting you to be like Stanley, is absolutely pissed off once again. He screams and shouts and lets it all out, and much like with the door on the right, the real player, an implied person controlling the act and you, who is stuck as Stanley, you're stuck as Stanley, not the real person, will be met with such a degree of aggression never apparent in the game otherwise by the narrator that they decide to quit the game, assuming they have tried both options at the two doors they had reloaded again and again. Yeah. They leave, and you gain their control. You no longer take the role of someone filling the role of Stanley. You are the person playing the Stanley parable controlling you. You are yourself, not Stanley to any capacity right now. You have movement options. You can crouch, you can interact with him, but you are absolutely not Stanley, and Stanley, left without a puppeteer, can't make a decision. As promised, now that I've walked you through both options, like the game forces you to go through both in one run, with some other real player being the one saving and reloading, here's what I think about this action, only the two paths. It's incredibly bold and powerful, so much so that without having looked at the rest of the game in a similar light to how I have for this video, it'll be hard to understand this implication that you aren't playing the role of a player controlling Stanley, but instead you actually are Stanley in this one ending as opposed to any other. Even if it first seems like the opposite, that this is actually the only ending where you are boldly at rest, a real person, but the game is aware there is a player controlling Stanley at times. This is where the game somewhat explains why there is inconsistency between addressing Stanley and the player. The human who installed and pressed begin the game is not the real person in control of Stanley. This works with everything. Seriously, the more I'm going over this video and thinking about things and gathering footage, everything works with this, and it changes nothing outside of this ending's closure. This is genius. There's no harm the game does by taking this chance and saying that the player was never the person playing the game, because the illusion of choice and control was the point of all endings. And the fact that the controller is how I'll now refer to the real human being, like flesh and blood, purchased, installed, blah blah blah. The fact that the controller is under this illusion twice more than they can imagine up to this point is nothing short of either exemplary immersion storytelling or perfectly lazy retconning that worked really well due to only influencing one ending, the one where the controller takes the role of Stanley for once and not the players, and someone else is the player. Let's talk about that part, the closure of the free choice ending now, but small note, if you come back and rewatch the video from the start, it's okay to treat whenever I say player as indistinguishably player or controller, as for every previous ending, the controller is implied to control the player. There are instances where there is value in knowing the player has a role separate and unstoppable aside from a restart by the controller, like the lack of choice and willingness to follow the narrator in the confusion ending, but there are no instances where lack of clarification between the two is needed in advance. In fact, maybe I'll actually decide to note every important distinction as I'm editing this, but not now. But back to the closure of this ending. Stanley was never his own being, or at least not one able to think and decide for itself. He presses buttons, that's about it. And the narrator, well, he doesn't have anything to do with you, all he does is, guide Stanley at his actions. And what happened here is Stanley is stuck. The save file being loaded by the higher entity is left as is, much like how you were left with the narrator when the game should have shut down. The narrator, who is at the mercy of Stanley's decision, is hopelessly stuck. Stanley will never move. He might never die. Listen to what the narrator finally admits here, finally sealing away the game context as a possibility of the game's message in any other point.
It cannot exist without you. Do you understand me? Whatever choice you make is just fine. They're both correct. You cannot be wrong here. We can work together. I'll accept whatever you do. I simply need you to take that step forward, please. Choose.
And as the narrator cries over how his game desperately needs Stanley, the developers tell you 3 words that I think were the biggest misstep of this ending. Thanks for playing. Do you understand what this implies? The idea of a thanking you so much for playing my game is undeniably a message told to players, controllers, who have just seen what is possibly the end or the end message of a game, especially this kind of game. And the credits, it's so fitting that the 2 last endings I chose to analyze both have credits and both involve someone else controlling the game in a way. The message here, no doubts about it, is this game needs you. Doesn't it? Isn't that a really cool message to close the game on? About choices, telling you your choices mattered all along and that choosing incorrectly is why the game is able to exist in the first place? Not exactly, considering you are unlikely to discover this ending while the game still really needs you. It's time to think back to the window. Oh, finally. If you don't know, to reach the out of bounds ending, Stanley must exit the window in the office block outside his own office. To do that, he needs to crouch because his hitbox is too high to pass the panel between 2 monitors, which you realize after climbing on the top of this chair by making sure you're moving as fast as Stanley can onto a specific polygon in the chair's collision in order to make the game think it's as much of a slope as any other staircase. What I described wasn't the plot of the game. It was as much of a choice as moving or not moving, whether or not you bash your head against the chair or not. You can't jump in this game, so expecting you to move up a chair, something I can't recall any more than 3 chairs in the whole game that you do. Hold on, play them. Oops. That's nonsense for Stanley. But you're not Stanley, you dummy. You're tired of Stanley. There is no reality in which the player decides to repeatedly run against various chairs in the office in order to find content without being told that they should. And while you might think that's an issue, because you are indeed never ordered to start climbing chairs, why would you try something like that? Or perhaps the question is, when do you get so invested in a game you have nothing to do in that you choose to unplug a phone? You will never find the free choice ending. As I already mentioned, the way to begin this ending is by unplugging the phone. Here's some other choices in the game. Here's how they look. Now let's look at this room. It is nothing similar to any kinds of choices you are given during the rest of the game. And this isn't any accidental design oversight. Because of the implication that it's an interaction the game didn't expect, it's clearly meant to be well hidden. But why? Why hide such a meaningful ending behind a minor interaction? My conclusion is that it's done that way to emphasize how much true choice would affect this game, or any other game for that matter, if it were possible, and sets up the rest of the ending narratively. So when you put 2 and 2 together, you get a really ugly 3 right here. The message, the idea that the game needs you, otherwise it doesn't exist, just doesn't sit well with the fact that this ending is something players are likely to find once already devoted to scouring the game for more minor interactions after exhausting the bigger, more obvious choices first. There's a pretty big chance many players won't get to hear this message about how the game needs them, because by the time they might have got to it, they just assumed the game had enough for them. However, all players are told a similar message in 3 other endings: the museum ending, the gaming ending, and the escape pod ending. I haven't talked about the escape pod ending yet, and that's because much like the Zending, this ending is really light on things to analyze, as the message it sends is extremely upfront once you even find out about it. So let's cover it quickly just in case. To begin this ending, you back out of the manager's office as the doors are closing. This is playing on the trope of glitches triggering doors in games, and instead makes the content. Now, locked outside of progress, all the doors you went through are now open. Going back to your office, instead, a new door is open, where a long line of stairs on catwalks, after which a large sign saying escape pod points to the right. In the small letters, sharp-looking players will notice the following text: both the player and the narrator must be present in order for escape to play out as intended. I'm gonna go ahead and ignore the fourth wall break presented here, as it's comparable to the confusion ending schedule. After this sign, the escape pod lights up, and a moment before you reach it, the game resets and actually often crashes for many people, because the narrator isn't present. Simply put, he is required to be there for your story and content, as simple as that. In the museum ending, the meta-narrator mentions how they both need one another, even with their conflicts, and in the gaming ending, the closure narration is the narrator talking about how Stanley needs him.
What I was trying to tell him. He needs me. Someone who will wrap everything up at the end to make sense out of the chaos and the fear and the confusion. That's who I am. That is what I mean to this world. Oh, yeah.
But in both of those endings, the aura of rebellion and self-expression the player carries with them by the nature of the game is still in place, and being told that you are dependent on something else is almost automatically rejected in the player's head, and often without even thinking about it. Many would ignore the saying that they and the narrator need each other so quickly that the closing message of the free choice ending could feel disconnected from the rest of the game, especially as it was hidden behind the secret interaction. The fact that it was hidden leaves doubt in the minds of a player being told they still mean something to this world. It could be interpreted as a promise that the game still has more offering for them. I'd like to bring another quote from Undertale about this, about having experienced every interaction in the game. By the time most players would find the free choice ending, would find the closing message with the credits of the game, by the time they found reward for scouring every inch of the map already, they've read every book, burned every book, won every game, lost every game, appeased everyone, killed everyone. So now the question comes, what do you do? What do you do at this point, where the game tells you that it still needs you, after you have probably seen everything? Option 1. Leave the game, listen to the meta-narrator and quit the game forever, stopping Stanley's constant death signaled only by the game's restarts, but leave the game that told you it needs you in its out-of-game context, not by lines of dialogue meant to be dismissed and laughed at, but by offering view into the game's true desires, and just leave. Option 2. Keep playing and possibly face no more content, just a game that needs you but may not offer you anything. Option 3. Look up online what's left, and allow me to advance the concept here and add that by doing that, you are spoiling yourself the act of choice. I'll repeat what I said in a second, but I want to just for myself establish a milestone of this video. The start of this section means that I have finally finished talking about each ending in a somewhat separate way. The only singular things I haven't touched on are the broom closet ending's existence and implication, Blood in Heaven, the various randomized office easter eggs and layouts, the whiteboard ending, various achievements, the serious room, the coward ending, the executive bathroom and elevator, calming new age music, disco secret, the game's demo, the game's trailer, and the implication of using a controller to play the game. As you can guess, I won't talk about nearly any of these, especially not in singular focus or in this video. These are things that I think would be wrong to try and gather meaning and conclusion from. I did my best to already come back to every undeveloped idea so far, but the exception is my claim that there is value in saying that putting content behind cheats can be interpreted as the game saying cheats might hide content. This will be relevant soon enough, I think, but I felt like I wanted to address that it's the only in-game concept not fully explored into a full idea left in the script so far. And now that I feel like I did everything needed to leave the game as a source behind and start talking about my own varying conclusions in relation to one another, it's time to finally enter hell. Let's do the worst thing I can possibly do. Let's define choice. The third option I provided for the question of what to do after the free choice ending was look up what's left online, thus spoiling yourself the act of choice. I had purposely not detailed the thoughts connecting the two parts of this statement in order to allow myself to question it myself. Let's ask ourselves, how far does the act of choice extend within the confines of the game? The narrator or game context implies in the free choice ending that it's Stanley's options of doors and buttons and maybe walking. He considers choice to only describe options his script accounts for. Quite bluntly, he asks the players to not do things Stanley wouldn't do, since Stanley can only make scripted choices at surface level. The meta-narrator, while being a contextual middle between the two other approaches, is not at all a middle between their look at choice. The game context is the middle in that aspect. I'll describe it in a moment, but in short, the out-of-game context says everything is a choice. The game context says many things in the game are a choice, but this time, the meta-narrator implies everything within the game isn't a choice. Your only choice is playing or not playing. It says that when every path had been created for you long in advance, life and death become meaningless. It's a dark and direct approach that practically means that if you do everything in the game, you never get to make a choice. Quitting the game after seeing it all isn't a choice, it's the only true path left. There's no value, not even a negative one, to replaying content if all was seen. The only choice in this approach is not seeing all the content, for Stanley's greater good. Get it? The meta-narrator actually talks about Stanley as Stanley, but is aware that Stanley is actually under the influence of a controller assuming the role of a player, but instead walking that player's scripted path. The out-of-game context implies the choice is trying everything you can as it may work. It's the layer behind the narrator's words, it's the understanding that if something is created, it doesn't matter what it says, it's content, and the choice of whatever led you to finding that content is choice. This can be broken, and can be broken hard, but let's come back to this later, trust me. So, all these approaches are ways you, the controller, can choose to look at choices. But you can also make choices way past these, outside of even quitting the game, as those choices will affect how the game is experienced by looking up a guide online. The reason I started defining a choice anyway. While all those other approaches are things majorly within and controlled and discussed by the game, it's unfair to expect this game to fully account for this new idea of choosing to look up guides online. I respect not choosing to address this at all, and I think leaving the game only to discuss and raise possibilities within itself is good, and would needlessly complicate the process otherwise, because then I would have to analyze the existence of the internet, and I am not interested in doing that. So, while looking up a guide online does not and cannot impact the game and the content on its own, it changes the feel of reaching an ending from making your own choices to simply seeing content. You have left the realm of in-game choices in search for content, and have made the real choice to see more content without the effort of making in-game choices that the game's developers designed, but instead choices that are not filtered and count as part of playing the game, and thus cannot dictate my opinion of the game. The real choice to skip finding endings and resorting to guides is comparable to the first option of the game needs you question from earlier, the choice of manually quitting the game on your own. However, I think these are quite opposite in effect. Skip gets you to miss out on the essence of the game's intended structure and various conflicts one will traditionally have to deal with themselves, instead knowing the choices to make in advance only to see new content. Quit is the very opposite. It's fully engaging in the game structure for yourself, making a statement as a controller and impacting the narrative immensely, but you technically miss content. Nobody thinks scrolling to the menu would provide content, that's very clear. So with both of those being distinct, the other option of trying everything is best suitable instead for the second option I mentioned earlier of trying to go back into the game after already have found a very deeply hidden secret in order to find even more. This is probably where most players will find all the Easter eggs I listed after the Freedom ending segment, but now will also be the time where a curious offender shows up, the Serious Room. If you do not know what the Serious Room is, it's an anti-cheat feature within the game. If you open the console, a staple of Source Engine games, and type in the globally known command for activating other advanced options, sv_cheats1, sv standing for server variable. The Stanley Parable game will detect this console command, and instead of enabling cheats, it keeps them off and loads a map called serious.bsp, the general map file type. This is the Serious Room. It's a room with no exits and a table, and upon being sent here, Stanley will be scolded for misbehaving and attempting to cheat, and is generally supposed to quit and just play the game. I won't talk about ways to overcome this, as I personally never did and never turned on cheats in Stanley, and as I want to focus on what the game allows for without outside modification, except the game allows for outside modification. In order to see this content, in order to get to this piece of narration, you need to externally enable the -console launch setting on Steam to access the console that will allow you to input the cheat enabling command in the first place. Let's continue this train of thought for a second. If there is content behind going into the game's external settings and modifying it there, is there an issue with removing the server settings that stop svcheats1 and putting in clean ones that allow for cheats? Because people can do that and have done that. I never did, but I know it's possible. It's a simple change and there really isn't anything denying that there is content that devs want you to see after doing this. DDLC had content behind the leaking save files, and even though that was a spotlight of that game, who said that the files here are where the game ends? You might say that's going too far, and I'd agree. Maybe the console command was fair game, but I think modifying files myself is absolutely not where I should look for content as I'm playing this game. So let's keep going with console. Other players have found that certain commands that don't use sv_cheats can still be activated as you're playing the game. For example, here's a command that switches the door's locked property to unlocks, and then one that opens the door. The game doesn't stop me. I have contrast to make here. I know that the game can stop me from accessing at least one command, but, well, what if I try all the others? I didn't try all of them, but here's one it allows. Doesn't mention, but doesn't ignore. So is replaying the game and opening every single locked door, world, portal, and gate really that different from getting to the Serious Room? You can say this isn't fair, that there's little chance that developers knew about all console commands. Hell, the console even prints out many error messages where the devs have attempted to use commands in-game and nothing happened, such as TSP menu narrator or TSP series pass, presumably cut content, which I can't judge because again, I only want to take a look at the final and current game. So if I want to do that, am I actually being unprofessional by not looking behind all the locked doors? Am I risking this video being uninformed due to me possibly missing out on critical content hidden behind a complicated console command? Of course not, that's ridiculous. However, it's not that the main game never hints at content behind the console. The whiteboard ending, which again isn't an ending but an Easter egg, actually says to put Bark in the console, another Easter egg, and yes, you do need to add the launch option to turn the console on. The office leading to that whiteboard also has a reference to the many tables the narrator considered putting in the Serious Room as pages on the floor, which is a nice connection. But the idea of cheats hiding more content is not outside the realm of possibility, and even pulling back, not going as far as cheating, there are functional oversights in the game. There are two memorable, seemingly unintended areas I know how to reach easily that do not provide additional content. One is getting on top of many shelves in the warehouse. This can get you stuck but is slightly entertaining and certainly not intended, and you can easily continue by jumping to your death. And the second is dropping down from the catwalks in the monitor room and then getting stuck on the floor. This is quite widely known and, yeah, just an area you can find with no content that feels just as unintended as some other that do have content like the office window. This is, I guess, a time that I actually critique the game. It's pretty much a fatal flaw if this was the only thing I told you about the game and not the magnificent things aside it. That it isn't delivering on its promise of content for usage of options, specifically after one of those hidden secrets being a major ending that tells you to keep looking. Here's probably the reason this distinguish even came to be. These empty points you can access just weren't found early enough. In many interviews, the developers mentioned that sometimes they'll add content based on what players did that didn't already have a response. The secrets of this game built themselves. Close yourself in a corridor? Let's add dialogue. Stood in a broom closet? Let's add dialogue. The problem is setting expectations oddly high with these. Everyone fondly remembers the broom closet, and they would all remember it much less if there were more areas like it, where there is clearly a comedic sacrifice of not moving for more dialogue. But the speed at which the player gets more broom closet lines really makes this feel like much less of a sacrifice. The longest time, yes, I checked, between 2 lines in the broom closet is almost 8 seconds. Not 8, almost 8. In comparison, standing in place in the starting area of the game for 50 seconds then rewards the player with repeating a joke, and I only found out about it as I was writing a part of the script as the game was running. I felt rewarded for my accidental experimentation, but I never for a second made an assumption that standing in every spot for too long would bring me dialogue. That would be so obviously tiresome. The concept that standing still everywhere is good to ensure I'm seeing all the content in the game. If you're the kind of person I am and are familiar with more games by the developers of Stanley, you might have seen this coming, but I'm fascinated that the very thing I just stated to be weird to put in a game is in every room of the lead level designer of Stanley's next game, Dr. Langeskov, and the long game title. Standing in place and not continuing the narrative provides at least 3 lines of dialogue per room. It's not a long game and not an engaging game, it's as involved as Stanley but without choices. You play it once or twice for the narrative and maybe the achievements, but it's a story, not an experience like Stanley is. So in that game, it's a touch to immerse the player's singular experience. In Stanley, everyone would feel as if they missed out on a huge gag if they don't stop everywhere at least once if that feature was included. So there, some critique in this video. The title, Full Narrative Analysis of the Stanley Parable, might not have warranted that, perhaps this section was unnecessary, but I need a way to talk about these parts, and since my comment here was that these parts don't exist, and talking about the dilemmas that stem from them, or them not existing, I can't think of another way to talk about non-existent content, seeing I can't analyze it. So that's almost it. I covered the 2 remaining topics I listed earlier, cheats and the broom closet implications, and that would be it. Except one thing. The game opens with a pre-rendered cinematic in 2 parts. The first being a character introduction of Stanley, and the second being the beginning of the story the narrator tries to tell, which, as established, is only jokingly presented as the game's main conflict. Due to this being more narrative blabber in the same tone as the entire Freedom ending, there's little value in analyzing the second part, but the first part is one of the most interesting aspects of the game for me to come back to after having analyzed the whole thing after it. Like I mentioned, the game's only happy ending, notably for the narrator, is the Freedom ending. It's not an accident that the last line in it is, "And Stanley was happy." However, like Game Studio Sleep pointed out in his video I mentioned earlier, that line is a repeat from the intro. It's extremely notable that before both instances of implied happiness, the reasons leading to said happiness are all listed by the narrator. Stanley isn't introduced as happy, but rather implied to be happy for feelings the narrator builds onto him. It is then implied that Stanley's happiness only ended once one day something peculiar happened. Stanley is not given any orders and is no longer content and happy for the reasons that made him such earlier, gets up and the game may begin. Let's understand what had to happen for this story to occur. Assuming Stanley is real at any point for the game, before the player and the controller assumed the role of Stanley, Stanley had been perfectly happy in the narrator's world that he had set up. The narrator, in order to get Stanley a happy ending, had to first make sure Stanley isn't already happy. In this aspect, the intro to the game is an ending. It's a flow from start to finish, begins with happiness, and then it is lost via the game restarting. or in this case, simply starting. The narrator himself even goes as far as to say that Stanley's nature was disrupted in this curiously immersion-breaking shot where the office is all that exists for Stanley, as if the rest only becomes tangible once Stanley needs to access it. It is at this point that the narrator says,
Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in, as though he had been made exactly for this job.
Knowing fully well he was created for this job, and for it to be taken from him. But we can read deeper into this. Many moons ago, I made a video that right now has little watching value nowadays, but it was called Analyzing All Video Games, where I defined all video games as programs that strictly require sets of button inputs to advance in any way. There are little to no exceptions to this, but I don't really want this terminology discussion here, but I also focused in that video on ranking games for once the frequency at which one is required to enter button input sets, assuming they do not pause or stand still to stall for time, and the second being the complexity of each of those button input sets. You can find examples on what this means in that video, but what I'm trying to mention is that even though control methods and inputs may vary greatly, they are still all, at ground level, repeated button presses at varying inputs to fulfill a request. Many games allow players to fulfill those needs with varying methods and combinations of button inputs, but others don't. All you do while playing a game can be equated to a guided version of typing a document. It's possible to infer that Stanley is playing somewhat of a video game. In order to advance the plot and fulfill the requests, he hits buttons as they show up on a monitor. Thank you for watching my narrative analysis of Mario Teaches Typing. Alright, so I can say Stanley was playing a game of sorts. Okay, cool. Now let's think about what happened leading to the events of the Stanley Parable. Stanley had realized that not one single order had arrived on the monitor for him to follow. He has no objective or guidelines to go towards in the game anymore. He saw everything. He can now leave. No longer would anyone tell him where to go, what to do, or how to feel. Whatever life he lives, it will be his. He had quit the game, he had no more options in, and began his own real life. Outside of what his life was before, seeing someone else for a screen. Something else. This is what the real player does in the free choice ending. They realize there is nothing left in either direction and leave. The game they had played has nothing left for them, even if it needs them. They have better places to be. There's more to life than buttons. Sometimes you need to make choices. By getting the implied true ending, all we do is begin the Stanley Parable in some level, in some reality. The meta-narrator is right. Press escape and press quit. Stop now and it'll be your only true choice. The end is never the end. All you can do is escape. Not anything the game calls an escape. Simply quit. It's okay. Not everything must happen. The end is never the end. The end is never the end. The end is never the end. This is what you are told every time you get an ending. The end is never the end. That it wasn't an ending. The system of the game wants you in. It wants to keep telling you stories, but your base choice is to stop. Which is, again, what the true player does as they leave you in the free choice ending. And then, that player exits their office. They have seen it all. Orders stopped arriving on the monitor in front of them. They got up and left. I guess I was half wrong by saying that that ending isn't any true ending, but instead, it is the true beginning. By making the Stanley being leave the game alone, that Stanley will exit their office and their journey would begin. The end is never the end, because the end only marks a new beginning, not for you, but for someone. Maybe Stanley, maybe not. Perhaps it doesn't really matter. And as you're about to quit the game yourself, letting Stanley live his life, you get to have one more look at the reality of the situation. You only left one instance of the game. The restart the game and quit the game don't mean the same thing, but the results are all the same. Quitting once only gets you to see one layer up, but stretches to infinity. The end might never be the end, but you can always leave. It's okay. The game needs someone, but it's probably fine. Somewhere deep inside, the game is fine. You can leave.
once was a man named Stanley, who people considered so manly. But the truth must be told, he was not very old and was quite particularly gangly. What Stanley liked most was buttons. He pushed them like some kind of glutton. He did it all day in a meaningful way, but his brain had long ceased to function. Which is why he is in this parable, and lives an existence quite terrible. And if you are not strong and keep playing along, you too will become quite unbearable. Yes. You too will become quite unbearable.
I apologize if you entered this video hoping for some kind of answer that can still allow you to play the game, perhaps make you feel more knowledgeable as you play it. By making a video called Full Narrative Analysis of the Stanley Parable, I suppose I owe you an answer to the question I said again and again that I was asking, what's the message I should leave this game thinking? Truthfully, I don't know. You should leave this game as part of the game. Like I just said, the complete circle of this game will be the day I put it down, knowing I don't need to keep it happy even if it says so. It's okay to leave things behind, especially a product with limited content. It's okay to leave without a conclusion, and I guess the game had indeed been telling me that for a very long time.
Or the journey, though they're always saying that life is about the journey and not the destination. So I hope that's where we are right now.
I suppose so. In fact, if you so wish, let's make that the conclusion, remembering the amazing experience the game just is. It's not about the end, it's about getting there, maybe even failing to get there, like I did. I didn't answer my question, but look at what I've done. I've taken apart a game dubbed impossible to analyze by its creators, and I found its one singular ongoing message. I've made observations on the symbolic meaning of a scene I've seen hundreds of people play through, took apart lines spoken 15 minutes apart from each other and found a deep inherent connection within them. I failed to experience the game correctly to prove a point. I had understood everything I can understand about the narrative of the Stanley Parable. Even if I didn't get to the end was never the end in the first place. But if that's the case, then I should know that the end is never the end, which kind of cancels my idea that what I just claimed was indeed the end, which would lead me to require a new end or give up on an end, such implying that the end is never the end, which I guess in itself is a closure. But if the end is never the end, that denies my claim that the end is never the end is the end, which would lead me to require a new end or give up on an end, such implying that the end is never the end, which I guess in itself is a closure. You can loop this back if you wish. I just find it extremely fitting that the conclusion is still impossible, but only within the confines of itself. You can stop watching now, Stanley. Thank you for playing. Your input was extremely valuable.